his new book. It's a great book, Confessions of an Illuminati, Volume 12. This Illuminati mind with the history, secret societies, and politics of the Jesuit New World Order under Luciferian court. Remember, he was with Owen a week ago and talking about the new Pope. Well, we're going to probably review some of this stuff. But as you know, in the last 40 years, there has been almost nothing written against the diabolical plots and almost 500-year-old story of the Jesuit-led New World Order in English. So have you ever wondered why? Because most authors and researchers prefer to avoid the subject because they are often unprepared or afraid of repercussion side effects from this powerful mega Illuminists, the Alumbrados Unscrupulous Society of Jesus, or Jesus, Jupiter, and Zeus. Jesus. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to have Leo, and he's on the other side of the spectrum, right there in California, enjoying life and having a great book. Number 12, I think, is the last one. We're going to ask him a lot of things. Leo, hello.
Oh, thank you for having me on, Colin. It's always a pleasure, especially because you are somebody who knows very well, is very versatile with Spanish and Portuguese culture. It's a pleasure to have this show with you because, as you know, the Jesuits were born in Spain when Ignatius Loyola
Exactly.
had this vision of his future endeavors in Montserrat, that beautiful place outside of Barcelona, which I visited a long time ago, which I guess you have visited too. I hope so, because you should definitely go to the Benedictine monastery of Montserrat.
I don't go to mountains. I don't go to mountains because otherwise I get caught by the aliens. I don't want to get caught by the aliens and get a probe at my anus.
Anyway,
so I try to avoid those places and places with cows.
Okay, whatever. Okay, Colin Rivas, today, as you know, we're touching a serious subject, though, especially because the influence that the Jesuits had on both Portuguese and Spanish culture is immense, to say the least. And the
Vatican, right? Tell us a little bit about the Jesuits. Some people probably need a bit of an intro, even though it's like 3-4 minutes. Who are the Jesuits? Was Ignatius Loyola the real one that actually founded these? Was a group or the Illuminati behind? What year we're talking about? 1600. They changed the dates to accommodate something. Why is the Vatican so Jesuit influenced too? And why do you have Ignatius Loyola University education? Because it probably is the best in the world. Have you studied there? Have you met some Jesuits? Was the Pope Francis Jesuit?
This is a very young Leo Zagami amongst the Jesuit here.
He's a Jesuit. He's a Jesuit coadjutor. He's a Jesuit coadjutor. Like Donald Trump. Trump and Leo are Jesuits coadjutor because they visited the university. What happened there?
Okay, first of all, the coadjutors of the Jesuits are another category. They are actually the ones who are part of the Jesuits. They don't accept all of the vows, but the ones eventually that you will associate with the Jesuits, but maybe they are in the business or in the political arena or in other fields, well, those are the so-called fifth-class agents of the Jesuits. So there is definitely some specifications to make. This book has been just published a few days ago, and it's already a bestseller on Amazon in History of Religions, Faith and Spirituality, Controversial Religious Knowledge. It's a book that I wanted to write for a long time, but I left for the end of my confession series because this is the last installment. There is not going to be any more Illuminati confessions after this one because, of course, I was writing an encyclopedia to volume 12. And now we are on top of the pyramid, there where you have the all-seeing eye, there where you meet the Black Pope. And we had, of course, Ignacio Loyola as the Spaniard who founded this order, like you said, inspired by the Alumbrados. But the Alumbrados were the Illuminati of his days, and they were accused of being heretics because they were mingling with Islamic mysticism, Kabbalah, Gnosticism. And he, in fact, ended up, Ignacio Loyola, under the lens of the Inquisitions several times because of his involvement with these Alumbrados. And so in this book, I really start from the very beginning, the 1520s, when Ignacio Loyola starts his spiritual path. And later on, we have in Montmartre in Paris, where he eventually ends up with his closest associates, founding on the 15th of August 1534 the actual order, which will then be formally accepted by the Pope 6 years later in Tivoli, near Rome. And that because they become, as you know, an instrumental order for the Counter-Reformation. This was the age in which the Catholic Church was starting to have some serious trouble with the advancement of Protestantism. You will have, of course, immediately after the foundation of the Jesuits, the Council of Trent, which is regarded as one of the pivotal moments of Catholic history. But Ignacio Loyola himself had been arrested several times by the Inquisition before being accepted in his mission. And eventually, because of his occult knowledge, because of the occult knowledge of the Jesuits, they actually ended up taking over the Inquisition, which, as you know, the Spanish Inquisition was fierce, as well as the Portuguese one, and it was in the hands of the Dominicans. But the Jesuits eventually, with their skills, ended up taking control of this whole thing. Now, first of all, my book gives you an historical perspective, but then brings you right into the present. So this is not just a history book, but it's also a book that brings you to the influence the Jesuits have today in the Vatican, an unprecedented influence, especially after Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. So, first of all, I explain why Loyola rised against Protestantism. He was accepted by the Church eventually, even if initially he was persecuted by the Inquisition. And so the controversial origins of the Jesuits are really part of the birth of the Jesuits, which I describe in Volume 1. The fact that they collect partly the tradition, let's say, of a military religious order like the Knights Templars, which is also a very important element, because after the Knights Templars were dismantled by the Catholic Church, there was almost a vacuum. And so the Templar legacy lived on with the Jesuits, though the mission, as I explained, is fundamentally different because, as you said, they are very much, their mission is education, and that was from the very start. But it's not only education, it's also becoming intelligence operatives, Vatican assassins, like my old friend Eric John Phelps used to say in one of the rare books that has been published in the last 40 years, because really there is very few books that have been published, including Malachi Martin, in the last 40 years. Nobody wants to really challenge the Jesuits because of the fact that they are the scientists of the church. They have a monopoly over education. Now, out of this period of Catholic turmoil of the origins, is born the Jesuit order, the Society of Jesus, or the Company of Jesus, as they used to be called. And even if nowadays they are mostly known as the Society of Jesus. They were accepted amongst the Vatican religious orders on September 27, 1540. And from that moment onwards, they participated to the Counter-Reformation in an ever so aggressive way because they had an element that was actually, the Pope saw this element and said, these guys are definitely guys who need to work for us and need to be part of the Catholic Church in this delicate moment. It was the fourth vow of the Jesuits, the vow of complete obedience to the Pope, meaning they will do anything for the Pope, even if it went contrary to their own faith, to the Christian Catholic faith. And that is also something very strange, of course. So Pope Paul III, who was associated with the Borgia family, despite his charges of paganism, because he was actually himself accused of being a pagan and having secular extravagances in his papal court, because of his war against Protestantism, which was growing more and more aggressive. I mean, people like Martin Luther saw the corruption of Rome and of the Vatican, and of course, people were abandoning the church back then. And at that point, the Jesuits ended up being instrumental in this context. They were ideal. They were not really proposed as a strictly religious military order like the Templars. I mean, they will not go around with a sword killing people officially. They will only do it in secret. Officially, their mission was education. But you can understand that the mission of education was also went hand in hand with the mission of gathering global intelligence. The early missionaries of the Jesuits ended up in places like China, India, Japan, expanding the influence of the Vatican all over the world in the most distant and remote places. It was at one point that, of course, we had a complete change. It wasn't only the battle against Martin Luther and the Protestant leaders, like, for example, Queen Elizabeth, which was also deemed as one of the biggest enemies from the Jesuits right at the start of their endeavors. It was also about creating a vast network that in some way could gather intelligence. And that's why they became involved with the foundation of the Vatican intelligence, known as the Holy Alliance. This Holy Alliance, originally, the name comes from the alliance between the papacy and Mary Stuart. So that was why it was
the
called
Catholic Queen, yeah? Of Scotland.
Yes, Catholic Queen. And there was always an attempt by the Stuarts and by the Jesuits to bring back a Catholic monarch to England after the birth of Protestantism. It never worked out for them because at the same time, like I explained, as you know, in Volume 1, Queen Elizabeth I was very versatile herself with the intelligence and with the occult. She had people like John Dee, who signed himself 007. He had people who definitely had vast knowledge to counteract what the Jesuits were doing. However, like I said, Ignatius Loyola was born Inigo Lopez de Onats Loyola in a municipality of Spezia, known as Gipuzkoa. Probably you know how to spell it better than me.
Is what they call the Basque Country.
Yes, and in fact,
nowadays it's a shithole. It's full of black people and all this stuff.
Well,
I mean, they're Basque people. They're very racist and they're very supremacist because they say they come from aliens and from Atlantis, and they were the first people.
As you know, they are very much separatist against.
Yeah, they were the first people on the planet. I mean, so much for that. That's what they say.
One thing that I remember back in the days, my father said he met one of the Basque leaders in Greece, and he told me about a unique experience with this guy who apparently was used by the CIA and by the local military intelligence to spread LSD all over Greece. So, I mean, definitely they are a particular kind of people. Anyway, going back to our to my book and to, of course, the history of the Jesuits. In 1522, Loyola, who was, of course, an aristocrat, a soldier of noble birth, who had joined the military at 17, had fought, had been, he had been committed also to fight in the Battle of Pamplona in 1521, where he was eventually injured. And for that reason, in 1522, Loyola, after a year of cures, he finally left his father's castle in the Basque region, which you just mentioned, and inspired by Ludolf of Saxony's De Vita Christi, he bowed himself to the example of people like Francis of Assisi. This is at least what I'm telling you, the more known religious side, but then you have the occult side. The fact that he was also obsessed by the occult, he was hypnotizing young ladies, he was practicing the occult of the Alumbrados, even if when eventually, the Alumbrados.
So question: He was like Francis of Assisi, Teresa of Jesus, and all these people. They have this nirvana ecstasy kind of experience, yeah.
Yes,
and then they think they're like illuminated, yeah.
Well, that is what eventually will bring him to write his spiritual exercises, which have become the core of the brainwashing of the spiritual power of the Company of Jesus. However, the Alumbrados, in a way, were influenced by the remnants of the Templar conquest. Let's not forget that the Iberian Peninsula and the Templars had established, in a way, in the Spanish provinces of Castile and Leon, Aragon, Catalonia, and Navarra, a lot of this influence that then manifested through the Alumbrados. The Alumbrados were feared very much by the Catholic Church for what they were doing, for the way they were thinking. However, Loyola recovered from his injury. He went to this Benedictine monastery of Santa Maria de Montserrat, which, by the way, I strongly advise you to visit the next time you are in Barcelona, because it's only an hour and something away. I went on a bus there with my grandmother, I think in 1986. But it was in the March of 1522 that he stood in front of the Blessed Mother of Montserrat, which was a Black Mary. Black Mary is Isis. So that is also the link of the Gnostic link. You see, there was a link right from the start that the Jesuits had with the worship of the Mother Goddess of Isis. And that link, of course, was cemented later on by the foundation of the first, one of the first universities, not the first one. The first one was actually established in Messina. Messina is where my father comes from, part of my family comes from. Messina is an important port in Sicily, which was used by all the knighthoods because it was the last pit stop, let's say, before going to Jerusalem. And so Messina was chosen by the Jesuits a bit to imitate the Templars. You see, Loyola was obsessed by the Templars in a way, so he wanted to imitate.
So you have the Templars in the 11th, 12th century, and then 3 centuries later, here rose another movement called the IHS, the Jesus Company or Jesus Company, the Company of Jesus, the Illuminarios, the Alumbrados, or Illuminati of Spain.
You see, the Alumbrados were inspirational to Loyola and his followers, but in 1534, when in Paris, because you see, at one point, all this persecution by the Spanish Inquisition led Ignacio Loyola to flee Spain and go to Paris.
But the Templars, they were bankers. Even before the Jews, they were anything at all. And these people, they were not bankers. And some of them,
different mission, Colin. They saw that the genie had got out of the bottle in regarding to banking. You see, they couldn't go back and do the same thing the Templars were doing. Their mission had to be much more insidious, and actually becoming important in the field of education led them to have an immense amount of power and control, because still to this day, the CIA, for example, recruits from Jesuit universities. So you see, this means they have a lot of influence.
Why do Jesuits, look after education, for example, or even sports? Because they're very into sports and education. How did they get there? I mean, there was an empty space there, or they saw it first, or what?
Let me explain. When, for example, after he had this mystical experience that brought him to this cave near Manresa, which is the capital of the Basque country there, and he basically formulated the spiritual exercises, He eventually, like I said, got in trouble again with the Inquisition. He eventually, though, got to Paris, and that's where, with his other companions, he forms the nucleus of the original Jesuits. And he decides that in order to influence and to become also accepted as a religious order which could help the Vatican in their mission of counter-reformation, education could be actually established in the constitution of the order as one of their main purposes. And that's the Pope had other orders at the time. The Dominicans were in charge of the Inquisition. You have the Benedictines, who were very much the early, also, they were transcribing the books before the invention of and then invented the first printed book. So, these were the people, the orders that were established before. He had to offer something new. And like I said, he offered absolute obedience to the missions that the Pope will give them, and at the same time, the mission of education, because with education, they could form the elite and become themselves very influential, as they are still to this day. Here in America, the most influential universities are in the hands of the Jesuits. Georgetown University with Bill Clinton, or you have Fordham, you have people like Dr. Fauci teaching at the Georgetown, but you have also many other people. Nancy Pelosi met her husband, who was also in a Jesuit secret society at Georgetown University. They actually established secret societies within the universities, the Jesuits themselves, so they can bring the students to have even more respect for their mission and to be even more connected. So when Donald J. Trump ended up in Fordham for 2 years, he was offered for 2 times to join these secret societies. I explained this in volume 12. And he rejected the idea. And that's why they hate him. And in fact, in my book, I bring several testimonies of people from Fordham who hate Trump and say, Trump betrayed the Jesuit cause, Trump betrayed the Jesuit ideals, which are inevitably leftist, inevitably pro-immigration, inevitably contrary to everything that stands with the true Americana values. Here we are in a country that was established, as we know, in 1776, prevalently by people of Protestant origin. However, as I explain in my book, the Jesuits, who had been suppressed in 1773, did everything possible to influence even the foundation of the United States of America, because it was instrumental to fight the Protestantism of England. So there is also that that has been said. However, going back to Ignazio Loyola, he created these spiritual exercises, these rules for discernment, these principles and foundation exercises that bring you in a state of mind like the one you were described earlier. A mystical state of mind that, as you know, though, can also become a way in which you are brainwashed. You also opening yourself with those meditations to forces that can lead you to believe things that are not real, or even being possessed. So you have to be very careful. However, the Jesuits became also the number one exorcist. In fact, the film The Exorcist, the main character is all Jesuits. Actually, the film The Exorcist, one of the characters, one of the priests, is acted by a Jesuit who does the part of a Jesuit. So, and it's, where is the film The Exorcist taking place, Colin? It's taking place in Georgetown University, in Georgetown. So, it's
Georgetown.
Really,
yeah. So, is that a university founded by the Jesuits? Yeah.
Of course. You're talking about one of the most influential Jesuit institutions, but there is many others. In America, there is about 40 Jesuit strongholds of institution. Why these days Trump has problems with the educational system in the United States? What do you think, Colin? Who is behind it? It's the Jesuits. The Jesuits,
no, it's the ultra mega hyper far right. That's not true. And
Uh,
also Elon Musk. Elon
no,
Musk is
no,
guilty by
no, no.
charge.
It's the
Elon
guy,
Musk is the one in charge of all the education with Doge or
Colin,
whatever it's called.
for those who are
No?
following us and maybe who don't know, you are joking because you like to be funny. But having said that, Donald Trump has challenged all his life the Jesuits after he went and learned from the Jesuits, just like myself. When I showed you this image, and in fact in my book I show this image, is because there is a whole part of my book in which I say people like me or Donald J. Trump for a few years studied with the Jesuits. It doesn't mean we are Jesuits, but it's highly possible that if you are in this Jesuit setup, you will end up with a Jesuit mindset and you will be brainwashed. So actually it's very rare. People like me or people like Trump are very rare because we are actually people who have resisted the brainwashing, who have refused their offers. I mean, I would be conducting probably a completely different kind of life if I accepted the Jesuit way of life. I have, people from when I used to go to school who are loyal to the Jesuits. They go every Sunday to Mass. They are all, all pious, all this, and they are subservient to this brainwashing. Having said that,
How did they get into South America? How did they get into China? How did they get into Italy? How did they get into all these places? How did they get this knowledge? Because Loyola had to get the knowledge from somewhere. It came from the Chaldeans, the Cistercians, the Druids, the Celts, the Templars, the Jews.
Like I said,
where did he get that?
Alumbrados and the Knights Templars. It was the Alumbrados and the Knights Templars. And in fact, if we go and see the early missionaries of the Jesuit order, especially the ones, for example, from Portugal, but in Portugal there were some orders that survived the Templar, let's say, the Portuguese Jesuits, apart from the fact that the Portuguese Inquisition was taken over by the Jesuits in a very early stage. I mean, the provincial of the Portuguese Jesuits, Diogo Mirao, of Spanish origin, became immediately involved, and they, let's say, in a short time, they took over the Inquisition tribunal in Portugal. King João III paved the way for the papal approval, as he was actually himself involved very much. You see, the thing is that people don't understand. The Inquisition was not just a religious endeavor. It was many times a political one. Mm-hmm. And so, in case you people don't know, but Portugal was a place where some Knights Templars had taken refuge and actually had founded some knighthood orders. And those, and in fact, some of those early Jesuits came from these knighthood orders. I mean, in the initial Jesuit growth was slow in Northern Europe, but they tried to infiltrate later on what is known as Rosicrucianism in the 17th century. But it was very rapid in Spain and most rapid in Portugal, out of all places, and Sicily, where Islam was deemed as a major threat, not Martin Luther King, Martin Luther, Martin Luther, and by 1565 there were
Martin Luther, the founder of the Protestant denomination, that it was as bad as the Inquisition because they started burning witches too and people like that. I mean, the only good thing that the Protestants added to our society was the tax. They were against tax, So I do think the Protestants.
I think that's a little bit simplistic because the Protestants, Martin Luther saw the corruption of Rome, and Rome was corrupted, Colin.
Well, that we know. They knew that before, because before they were all Catholics. So even Henry VIII knew that. Right?
Were corrupted. I think that Martin Luther, Calvin, but also, the rise of Protestantism in places like England. It was all due to the fact that the Catholic Church failed. They showed themselves weak. And I mean, you can't preach something and then don't practice it.
But the Protestant in England, they were very, very harsh on Puritans. That's why the Puritans had to leave for America. They couldn't even live in Holland or Switzerland or France, you know.
Having said this, later on in the 18th century, the kings of Portugal, France, Spain, and Naples became involved with the suppression of the Jesuit order, because they saw that the Jesuit order was pushing values that were contrary to mainstream Christianity, and also they were involved with the reducciones in South America. Now you ask me a specific question: how did they spread so fast around the world? And that is very important to describe this point for our viewers. You see, the fact is that the Jesuits seem a group of innocent priests, a religious order, but in reality they act like a secret society. And they took orders from the papacy to not only counteract, like I said, the Reformation, but also to spread their influence in remote places, regardless of spreading Christianity. That's why, for example, when Matteo Ricci arrived in China, he ended up becoming the advisor of the emperor. When Ippolito Desideri arrived in Tibet, he wasn't really there to bring them the gospel. He actually became himself a lama, a Tibetan lama in Lhasa. So it's like they prefer to acquire information, knowledge, experience, and exchange real knowledge. Like, for example, with China, they gave mathematics, astronomy, and in exchange, China gave the art of war. In fact, Sun Tzu's Art of War was translated by Father Amiot, the Jesuit. So this is the whole thing. When eventually, in the 18th century, in the early 18th century, the Christian Catholic powers started to see that these people were really a threat to society, because it wasn't a religious, I mean, their education, their system of education and everything was built so they could always relay all the information to Rome and all the control of that education to Rome. So already in the early 1760s, France started to kick them out and to transform the universities that they had founded in something different, taking them under the control of the state. Ingolstadt, where eventually Adam Weishaupt will found the Illuminati, is another example. After the suppression, Ingolstadt was transformed. But Ingolstadt
von Nisch, Adam Weishaupt, all these people, were they Jewish? Were they Jesuits? Were they from families of Templars? What do we know?
Regarding the Jewish element, there is a lot of talk, of course, of Ignazio Loyola, for example.
Being Marrano.
Yes, a Marrano. And definitely we can notice that in the early Jesuits, there was a strong Jewish presence. But soon after, because of the fact that, as you know, there was a war to convert the Jews, they ended up prohibiting the entrance of the Jews in the Jesuit order a few decades later. But that happened when they eventually took control also of the Inquisition. So the actual, in this book,
that was difficult centuries later, because they couldn't distinguish or tell the difference between a converted Jew that was for 3 centuries already a Christian and
They made a specific law to forbid entrance to Jews. They made actually.
They had to eat ham. They had to eat pork. I mean, what was the task or the test?
Let me explain it a little bit, because this whole situation about anti-Semitism and the Jesuits is very important to understand. Because if today we have so many anti-Semitic conspiracies, anti-Jewish conspiracies on the internet, is because of the Jesuits, by the way. Now,
because. Pointing the fact that when the Greeks were the rulers, the Jews were no bankers. when the Romans were the rulers, the Jews didn't exist. I mean, there were no bankers before the Jews being bankers and capitalists. They were the Templars. The Templars, they were the bankers and the financiers of everything. And the few Templars, they died or they burned at the stake. Well, that's fine. But then you had loads of them that I know they converted to Judaism too because of the Kabbalah. No? They believed like it was a scientific system.
Those who stayed protected, like in Scotland, like my family, the Lyon family and the Sinclair became the basis for then what became later on Freemasonry. That's why one of the first Grand Masters of the Grand Lodge of England was a Lyon family member. However,
but who used the Jews as a cover? The Templars or the Jesuits? Who is using the Jews as the baddies? Because the Jews can be capitalists and communists at the same time. So it's a contradiction. You understand?
No, but the Jews were always regarded as enemies, or at least as somebody they needed to control from Rome. Rome, I mean, if you think about it, the papacy inherited ancient Rome's legacy. And so we go back to the fact that the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. Let's not forget that. However, going back a second to what you asked me about the Jewish descent that played a role in forming also the education, the spirituality and philosophy of the first Society of Jesus in the 16th century in Spain. There was the rise of the so-called limpiezza de sangre that stopped everything, this purity of laws in the 15th and 16th century Spain, that the opportunistic Jesuit immediately took on board, and then restricting the membership of the conversos, which are the new Christians of Jewish origin. And the even more insane thing of this anti-Semitic early twist in the history of the Jesuits, was that on more than an occasion, Ignazio Loyola, as elected leader of the newly founded Jesuit order that he founded together with other 6 individuals in Paris, Montmartre, before going to Rome and getting accepted, was had to say that he himself, Loyola, would have liked to have been born of Jewish blood because he would be then closer to Christ our Lord. Now, his attitude was considered rather remarkable at the time because there was strong negative feeling against new Christians, the conversos. And people descended from these converts to Christianity, from Judaism or Islam, and is native there in the Basque territory, they were always regarded with a little bit of distrust. The new Christians were simply not trusted as genuine Christians, and so were forbidden to hold office in church or state. While there's absolutely no testimony or historical record that Ignazio Loyola was himself Jewish, though is claimed by many people,
I don't think either.
No.
Question. Why did they expel him from so many countries? Why did they expel the Jesuits from so many countries, Leo?
That is later on. But let me finish this.
Okay.
Some scholars have explored the possibility of his conversos background, on his own reflection on his lineage, because it's suggesting a little bit the Jewish descent. However, for example, Diego Lainez, who was one of the original companions at the University of Paris, was of Jewish blood, and so was also the famous Juan de Polanco, who was Ignazio's personal secretary that he loved very much, and was a collaborator and one of the guys who served in actually building and writing down the Jesuit constitutions. But then powerful figures like the Archbishop of Toledo tried to forge an idea and then force the society to abide by that purity of law prescription. However, like I explained, later on, the Jesuits will be instrumental in spreading the Jewish conspiracy theory, because it was a Jesuit, Agustin de Baruel, as you know, exposed the French Revolution as being made by the Freemasons, the Illuminati, and also in some way he linked it to the Jews. And of course, we have the protocols of the Sages of Zion, which so influenced in some way by the Jesuits and by what is known as the Simonini letter, which was received by Father Baruel. So, and then of course there is
question. Since you mentioned the protocols of the elder of the couch, of the Zion, of the couch Zion, whatever, aren't they similar to the protocols of the Illuminati? The same leitmotifs, the same objectives of the Illuminati.
The actual original inspiration came from this letter from a guy called Simonini, who sent this letter saying that he himself is the infamous Simonini letter. He sent it in 1806 to Baruel, who got this letter of this guy, Jean-Baptiste Simonini, and this Jean-Baptiste Simonini said that the Jews had a leading role. However, Father Agustin Baruel initially didn't want to mix this letter to his own writings, and he eventually refused to publicize it, if not amongst his closer friends. But that was enough to then lead to the Protocols of the Earthly Society. That, by the way, I've also discussed, as you know, in volume 10 of my Confessions, because they are also linked to Maurice Joly, this Freemason, and also the Sabbatean Frankist, because that is another important element of our story. Let's not forget that the Frankists, Jacob Frank, were on the contrary of Shabbatai Zevi, linked to the Catholic world. They brought thousands and thousands of Jewish converts to the Catholic world. And of course, in a moment, in a specific moment of time, where there was also very much the interest of the Jesuits, who were kept alive during the suppression, especially in Eastern Europe, because they were kicked out by most European countries, but they ended up, strangely enough, being protected by the Russians. However, in regards to Simonini's letter, it was published in the year that basically was, we have Maurice Joly, who publishes this dialogue between Machiavelli and Montesquieu, which inspired in part the Protocols, published in 1864, and that inspired the Protocols. And he died in 1878, the year the Simonini letter was finally published in the Parisian magazine Le Contemporain. So there is some links here. And then we know that, for example, the Jesuit publication, La Civiltà Cattolica, which started in the 1850s, features the Protocols before the Protocols even appeared. They made a long series of articles in support of anti-Semitism in the late 19th century. The Jesuits basically announced with great satisfaction the first congresses led by anti-Semitic movements. You have to understand that the Catholic Church and the Jesuits had found an scapegoat which was ideal. I mean, nobody... You see, in my book, I explain how Adam Weishaupt, the Illuminati, the Freemasons of the Age of Enlightenment, of course, manifested that idea that was already experimented by the Jesuits in their reduzione, in their reductions in South America, which is the idea of communism. Communism is a dangerous virus, at least in my eyes, that the Jesuits seem to spread and embrace, and especially when they saw the birth of the Age of Enlightenment. You see, the spread of certain ideas during the Age of Enlightenment, the Jesuits themselves ended up embracing and then developing the concept even further. So I think that of course, without the Sabbatean Frankists, the heretical Jews, the ones that will embrace, and then you have Karl Marx, of course, publishing his manifesto. But without the Jesuits,
but Karl Marx, he was a Zivite. He was a Sabbatean Zivite, like many of these crypto Jews. Yeah.
Without the Sabbateans and the heretics in the Jewish culture, the Jesuits would not have been able to further their ideas, their progressive ideas. Anyway, you were asking me about Adam Weishaupt, for example, was a professor of canon law who took the place of a Jesuit professor, but he was shaped and he was brought up in Ingolstadt University. And Ingolstadt was not only the Ingolstadt University, but it was the main base for the Jesuits in Germany, where Ignazio Loyola had sent some of his first missionaries. So Weishaupt officially fights the Jesuits, saying the Illuminati that he founded are against the Jesuits. But then Adolf Knigg, who was, as you know, the main collaborator of Adam Weishaupt, after 3 or 4 years of being part of the Illuminati, he walks out of it and he accuses Adam Weishaupt of actually being a Jesuit in disguise, of doing the work of the Jesuits. So this
is very well reflected on this movie. I think Alexandre Dumas, The Count of Monte Cristo, where you have a Jesuit in jail. They put the French, the Jesuits in jail because the revolution is being promoted by the Frankists and the Jacobins. That were Jacob Frank, the Jacobins. That's why they call it. And then you have the Count of Monte Cristo, and the Jesuit seems to know how to fight. He can even have some kind of hypnosis powers. He has also knowledge of hidden treasures, right?
Yes,
so
yes.
Alexandre Dumas is telling you something here about the 1800s.
Forget, though, Alexander Dumas was a Freemason himself, and of course, a Freemason. He had been, you see, the Jesuits had infiltrated in the early stages Freemasonry from the 1730s. They had a lodge in France, the Lodge of Saint Edward, and this is confirmed by Masonic historians who are now confirming all of my research also through the Vatican archives. There is actually, at the moment, currently, a Masonic investigation that is taking place with the Masonic historians. I don't want to tell their names because, of course, they gave me the privilege of confirming that everything I wrote in the book was correct. But they found out that the Jesuits were part of this establishment that then led to the high degrees of Freemasonry, which are now known as the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite. And everything that we find in the high degrees, which is, of course, the Templar degrees, is connected to the Jesuits. So, Baruel, it's important to explain a little bit this element also of my work. Agustin Baruel, as you know, wrote this incredible book that everybody knows about because it's one of the first conspiracy books, is regarded as one, the memoirs illustrating the history of Jacobinism. Okay, now he is a Jesuit, so he will never blame the Jesuits. So in this book, you will only find the Illuminati, the Freemasons, but then nobody connects to the Jesuits. Rather, instead, like I said, Baruel will prefer to embrace the idea of the Jews as the ultimate controllers, the supreme controllers. But in reality, even then you have, of course, aside from Baruel, you have also another important so-called conspiracy theory, which is John Robinson. John Robinson writes that very important book, which is Proof of a Conspiracy Against All the Religion and Governments of Europe. And he was, though, the first secretary of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was a very serious guy who got his information from a Benedictine monks. Now, they both seem to knew each other, and they both blame everything that is connected to the French Revolution, of course, to the Freemasons and the Illuminati. But in reality, the Freemasons and the Illuminati were controlled, as also the right of strict observance teaches us, from the so-called superior inconnu, SI, which in reality are the initials of Società Jesus. And there was one Mason at that time who dared exposing the Jesuits behind the whole thing. But he was a very rare individual, and he was almost unknown at the time, and is definitely unknown now, because, like I said, the main conspiracy theorists that ended up influencing very much what we still discuss to this day are Agustin Baruel and the other guy. While instead, there was a Freemason who had a vision, and I talk about him in my book because I think he was the only one from the Illuminati. I was a member of the Illuminati who dared exposing who was really controlling the Illuminati and Freemasonry at the time, rather than John Robinson or Baruel. And this guy was called Ernest August of Goansen. And this guy was it's a guy who had direct experience with both the Illuminati and the Freemasons. And in fact, a very high-level Illuminati and Freemason called Carl Leonard Reynolds, who had been also a Jesuit, ends up writing to another member of the Illuminati in Berlin called Christopher Friedrich Nicolai, and they say that Goansen was a snake in the grass and that he had betrayed the Illuminati order by exposing also the link to the Jesuits. So you see, this link to the Jesuits is very much kept aside from even the early conspiracy theories. And so
you have a lot of groups here. They have joined together to they go together in concert.
Let me
fuck up the rest, right?
Let me put the name here, if I can post this comment. I don't know, with the name of this guy, so people know who I'm talking about. I put it on my comments because what was the name is Ernst August of Goansen. So he was a member of the Freemason and of the Illuminati.
How do you spell the last name? Spell the last name there.
It's spelled. I put it on the chat so people can read it. You can find it on the chat. You see the chat?
You put it on the chat. It's here. It's here. Ernest August of Goansen.
It's really difficult to spell, so I needed to.
Well, we're gonna move forward. Second World War. We have Hitler writing the Mein Kampf, but he didn't write the Mein Kampf. Actually, a Jesuit wrote the Mein Kampf for him. Is that true?
Okay, first of all, the Mein Kampf profoundly inspired, of course, by the Protocol of the Sages of Zion. The link of the Nazis to the Jesuits, I talk about it because Adolf Hitler was one of the few people who admired the Jesuits. And of course, Himmler with his SS were very much built on the structure of the Jesuits, hypothetical structure of the Jesuits. So, yes, Hitler was probably one of the few people in history who understood that the Jesuits were inspirational. And not only that, as I explain in my book, when Hitler's troops were invading Russia during World War II, along with the SS, they were Jesuit converters because the Jesuits were fighting and wanting to regain. You see, they had been protected by Russia for a brief period, but then they were kicked out of Russia again. And the Jesuits still to this day are supporting, for example, Ukraine against Russia because they hate the Orthodox Church that is not controlled by them. And at the moment, we can say that the only Orthodox Church that is fiercely independent and non-influenced by the Jesuits is the one in Russia, because the one with Patriarch Bartholomew, so the other ones, sadly, they all have some form of compromise or infiltration. So I think we have described the Jesuits today historically, but in World War II, they were extremely influential on both sides. Like I explain in my book, they are very ambiguous, the Jesuits. So while they were having secret meetings with Freemasonry to prepare for when the Nazis will be defeated, at the same time, they had Jesuits who were allied with the Nazis in case the allies were defeated. So you see, they are ambivalent. And like I explain in my book, then you have, of course, after the war, the Second Vatican Council in the first half of the 60s, the transformation of the Catholic Church that becomes more and more progressive. The Jesuit general, the Spaniard, Pedro Arrupe in particular, embrace this progressivism, and from that moment onwards it starts.
He was the one, Arrupe, sorry to interrupt you, Arrupe was the one that was in Hiroshima and Nagasaki faking the nukes. He was faking the fake nukes because nuclear bombs do not exist. It's another fake, another hoax, and therefore
I want to know that this is your statement, not mine, but I confirmed in this book that
it is mine. It is mine, and many authors, many physicists say this.
Where I base everything on facts, Pedro Arrupe was arrived in Hiroshima after the explosion, and definitely I also explain how the Japanese had kicked out the Jesuits several centuries earlier, and they only
many times, and they gave him territories, they gave him lands, and then they took him away.
Regained, let's say, importance under the Meiji Emperor after the shoguns had kicked them out badly.
The shoguns, right? Yeah,
they were very dangerous. So now, in regards to the Jesuits in Asia, I have dedicated also a vast part of my book because they have been extremely influential in developing China, in developing the whole globalist idea, Shanghai. They actually invested money in Shanghai to develop what is now the number one force in the world. But the upcoming conclave, probably we have two options the Jesuits are giving us. Now, there is Father Antonio Luis Tagle, who is a Chinese Filipino, who is, of course, also working with who has studied with the Jesuits, and who actually admits on a video, which I showed yesterday, that the Jesuit in some way brainwashed them, and basically they tricked them in becoming a priest. He admits that on camera. Or otherwise, we have maybe the possibility of a first African priest, like Cardinal Turkson, for example, or another African. But at the moment, the conclave is decided by, of course, what Pope Francis has prepared with 80% of the cardinals he elevated, but fundamentally because of the Vatican-China deal. And the China has a lot of interest also in Africa. So if it's not the first Asian Pope, it will be the first African Pope. But this is basically...
So they want to convert all the immigrants into Catholic. So they have a huge following of African and Mexican, South American wetbacks.
Catholic. Well, like I explained...
Question.
Like I explained, in fact, that Trump is a big problem for them because the immigration policies, the invasion that we saw during the Biden era was driven by the Jesuits in Central and South America because changed
the Catholic. He's Catholic in mind, yeah.
Yeah, sure. Because they
question, Leo, and we have to wrap up. Question, and very important question. The Jesuit, the Pope. The next Pope is going to go on with the same progressive lefty, going even to the left, woke, like John Paul II and all these shit popes.
I would say that actually John Paul II was not so woke. In fact, he had an argument with...
he was left. He was not woke, but he was communist, almost. Even though they were saying on the surface he wasn't communist.
To tell you the truth, John Paul II was actually an anti-communist, and that's why he filtered millions through the Vatican Bank to fight communism. But there was another era, and he, in fact, wanted to commission the Jesuits under Pedro Arrupe. and he argued with Pedro Rupert. So John Paul II is a little bit different than the scenario. But however, even
you're saying John Paul, he was social democrat, but he was not lefty. He was not right.
In fact, the first, let's say, when the China's patriotic Catholic Church start to creep in, thanks to John Paul II, and then later on it got worse with Ratzinger, and eventually they signed the China-Vatican deal in the fall of 2018. So thank you so much for having me on your show today. As usual, it was a very interesting chat. Colin, I hope that you study this book, and the index of this book explains already that this is a very serious book. Like we said, unfortunately,
all your books, they're serious, man. They're big pages, big information. I mean, you got a big brain there going on, man. It's like,
thank all the people who have followed us live, of course, on your channels as well as mine. And we speak soon. I'm sure that things are going to get even more interesting after the election of the Pope. So we will speak again probably after the election of the
after the Black Pope, progressive, woke, and he's going to go on with the left. So they left to the left, and we're going to go on with the left.
He's either Asian or black, but he's definitely a Jesuit, communist, woke, leftist Pope, and he's going to bring, in the end, the papacy to an end, because, like I explained in this book, there's also a project to eliminate the papacy altogether after the Pope is elected. So please check out volume 12 of my Confessions, which is the history, secret societies, and the politics of the Jesuit New World Order and their Luciferian court. It's a book that you need to have, and if you actually read this book while the conclave is going on, you're going to definitely have
you're going to get a lot of good points
of what is happening.
And remember, people, that Jesus didn't pay taxes and didn't vote. So that's the message.
All the best.
Don't pay tax, don't vote.
Ciao, a presto.
Ciao, bello.
Of course, we're gonna have a pope.
Of course, the last pope, the last black pope, or something like that. I leave you people with some nice thoughts there. And all the questions we ask Leo. Get the book and get on realcolinrivas.com or colinrivas.tv or colinrivas.show. Thank you, everyone, from any part of the world, United States, England, America, Russia, or whatever. Take it easy. You know, it's all a show. It's all a show. It's all a theater. That's what Shakespeare said. Bye-bye. Ciao, amigos.